everyone. It's nice to meet you. I'm just going to give a quick introduction before I begin. My name is Neil. I am and have been an English teacher for over 10 years now. I've taught predominantly in Ireland and also in Japan, and I've taught all ages from young to old. So you could say I have a bit of experience in teaching, and I've learned a thing or two or three along the way. I have a big interest in languages as a whole, not just English and teaching languages, but learning languages myself. And one thing that I want to focus on today is vocabulary. And that is, of course, making vocabulary stick. And because I'm sure you know yourselves, vocabulary retention is kind of a problematic thing for many learners. And I don't want to say it's anyone's fault, really. I don't want to say it's the teacher's fault for not doing things right, or it's the student's fault for not doing things right. Um, it is a hard thing to remember a lot of information. So how can we make that vocabulary more memorable and more meaningful? Well, this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to present some research, not my research, but other people's research and findings. And then after that, I'm going to present to you some of my methods also, based on these kind of research findings. And basically, I hope this helps you, uh, if you do use these methods, to help the students retain more vocabulary. I've been trying and testing these methods myself, and I've had a lot of success. Now, I don't want to say that this is a 100% foolproof method. Nothing is. So I'm not going to make any absolute promises here. But as I said, there is a difference I find personally when you do try methods like these. Okay, so I'm going to go straight into it now. Just a moment. Okay, can everybody see my screen? I hope so. Good, I see thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, so here we go. Let's begin. And I'm going to talk a bit about the research and the science of it all. Okay, so let's start with vocabulary and its retention. So basically, the research shows that traditional vocabulary instruction it only achieves about a 15% retention rate, which is, I'm sure you can agree, very low. But using evidence-based approaches, which I will talk about later, things like spaced repetition and multimodal techniques that can improve the retention rate up to 80% or more, which is a significant difference. So I'm going to also focus mostly on adult learners here, maybe teen learners as well. It could apply to all ages, of course, but as I said, the focus here is adults because, of course, the way adult brains work and how they acquire and consolidate new vocabulary is quite different from when they do this as children. And maybe the problem here isn't necessarily the learner and the learner's ability, but it's maybe how they acquire using traditional teaching methods. I'm not trying to attack the institution or attack the teachers themselves and say that you're doing it wrong or anything like that. But it's just one part of it. And okay, let's continue with the research. So I'm just going to talk quickly about adult brain vocabulary challenges. So basically, adult brains face unique challenges in vocabulary acquisition. And a research that was done with about 700,000 participants revealed that language learning ability remains stable until approximately the age of 17.4, but after that it starts to decline. And this is because of fundamental changes in how the brain processes new linguistic information. Children have something that's called deep motor area processing. You don't need to remember that term, but it's basically an unconscious or automatic language processing, kind of like when you learn how to ride a bike, but adults rely on a different kind of mental processing that demands more conscious and effortful analysis of vocabulary and language. So the problem with this is, again, according to the research, adults maybe can memorize vocabulary lists quickly and they can reproduce that vocabulary on things like tests, but then the problem is they struggle to access those words naturally during things like spontaneous conversation. And the primary culprit in the whole thing is working memory limitation. So basically, adults can only hold about 6 or 7 bits of information in their working memory, and this is for mere seconds without active rehearsal. So this creates, as we call, a bottleneck for keeping that vocabulary, retaining it in the long-term storage. And then I'm going to talk about something called the forgetting curve challenge. And this is research that was done a long time ago in the late 19th century by someone called Hermann Ebbinghaus, if I pronounce that correctly. The forgetting curve is basically a representation of how quickly information is lost from memory over time if there's no attempt to retain it. And basically, without any kind of intervention, strategic intervention, adults will lose 50% of newly learned vocabulary within 30 minutes. That's quite a lot, and that's quite fast. And 24 hours later, they've probably already forgotten 70 to 80% of that. And maybe in your experience as a teacher yourself, you've found that's true. Like, how many times have you reviewed vocabulary the next day with your students and they're looking at you with blank faces, like you're talking about completely new words that they never knew existed before? It does happen. So, uh, yeah, basically the steepest forgetting, and I'm talking about again this forgetting curve, the steepest forgetting occurs immediately after the initial exposure. Okay, so this is why, introducing the vocabulary and doing some exercises like, matching to definitions or using the vocabulary in sentences, it's a nice start, but it's really only the beginning. And if we don't try to help them to retrieve that vocabulary later and consolidate that vocabulary and make that vocabulary meaningful, then it's going to disappear very quickly. Okay. So I'm going to skip that. Okay. Now, this is maybe the controversial part. I'm going to talk about the critical flaws in traditional vocabulary instruction. So if you look at the facts here, it says that students need about 12 to 14 meaningful encounters for full acquisition. And I will talk about meaningful encounters later. And apparently ESL programs provide only about 5 to 10% of instructional time that's dedicated to vocabulary work. So what does that mean? Okay, should I spend more time on vocabulary? Well, yes, but then you're probably wondering, what about the other skills? What about speaking? They need to do speaking and listening and writing and reading and whatnot and grammar. But there's the thing, vocabulary is amazingly flexible. We use vocabulary in all those skills. And that is something that I'm going to show you how to do later. Okay. But another thing is the brain's filtering system. And now this is really important because basically, if the vocabulary doesn't have any meaning, any personal relevance, if the students can't really connect to the vocabulary, then they're not going to remember it. You know, how often do you remember things that aren't meaningful for you? And how well do you remember things that are meaningful for you? So when we do things like generic vocabulary lists from textbooks, basically it kind of blocks the filters before it can reach proper memory storage. So again, I'm not trying to say don't do this. This is only really one part of the process. And there are actually four stages in this process. And this is called the four-stage consolidation process. And this is something that was developed by a man called Paul Nation. There are four stages, as you can see. The first is meaning-focused input, then meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and then fluency development. And okay, I'm going to talk quickly about what those are. So meaning-focused inputs, this is basically when we learn through understanding from context, when you listen and you try to understand as much as possible from context. The same as reading. It's a focus on understanding the content and not just the language itself. So for example, when they read a story in class or when they do a listening exercise where new words appear, as we say, context is key. The next one is meaning-focused output. So this is using the language that they learned to express meaning, for example, in speaking or writing. The learner focuses on communicating ideas using the target language. And you probably do this in class. This could be, for example, writing personalized sentences in the second language or speaking with a classmate, for example. It does say that this type of learning has a smaller effect size than other types of learning, but it is still important. The next one, this is basically primarily what we do as ESL teachers and instructors, language-focused learning. So this is direct, intentional study of language forms like words, grammar, and pronunciations. And we might do things like word lists, vocabulary exercise. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is a waste of time, but it's one part. It's one stage in the four stages in total. So the idea here, basically, what I'm trying to tell you is that this one is not good enough on its own. We need to try and bring that vocabulary through the four stages. And of course, there is also the fourth one, fluency development. And this is practicing language that you already know, so you can use it more quickly and easily. Okay. Okay, that is basically the research. Now I'm going to start talking to you about some ideas that you can do in the classroom. These are ideas and methods that I've experimented with. And as I said, I've had generally good success with these. I've noticed when I do this that students will naturally use the vocabulary spontaneously in not that specific context, but other contexts, whether in speaking or writing, sometimes weeks later. So you could say, okay, it's anecdotal evidence, it's my anecdotal evidence, but from my experience, it does work more effectively than the traditional methods that we use. Okay, so here's my first idea. This is the word of the day or the phrase of the day. I think this is something that you should do every day if you do see the students every day. I know everyone teaches differently, but I'll explain here. I see the same students every morning or every afternoon, and Monday I'll introduce a word or a phrase of the day. Now, this should be something that is used commonly in spoken English, especially something colloquial, and especially something that they're probably not going to encounter in a textbook or in a classroom setting, in a traditional classroom setting, I should say. Now, when you introduce, and I'm going to give you some examples of this, but as a summary, when you introduce these phrases or these words, you have to provide common, relatable examples. If they're not relatable, then the students are not really going to process them so well mentally. And then after I get the students to use the word or phrase in personal, relatable context. And this is so important because as I said before, if the vocabulary and phrases are not relatable, if the students don't make them personal, then they just forget them. And then, if possible, if you do see the students in later days of the week, ideally every day of the week, you can bring back that vocabulary on later days in different context using different activities. So I'm going to show you the first example. So this is a word that I did with pre-intermediate students and intermediate students. It's the word way. So as in the example, it's way too hot to go outside today. I ate way too much food and now I feel sick. So these examples probably relate to everyone. I'm sure everyone has experienced something like this at least once in their life. Have you ever gone outside and you thought it was way too hot? Maybe you've eaten too much food to the point of feeling sick. Um, and then I will concept check what we normally do or should do. And I would ask, for example, okay, it's way too hot. Is this positive or is it negative? It's negative. Does it make me feel good? Do I feel good after eating the food? No, because I ate way too much food. And if you can see me, notice what I'm doing. I'm gesturing. Gesturing is very important. Even better if you can get your students to copy your gestures. I know some adults are not so receptive to that, but give it a try. You never know. Then, when I've introduced my examples and when I've concept checked, I get them to personalize it. Personalized contextual writing. Now, this is just one thing you can do. You could do other things like speaking, but in this one, for example, I got them to write. Now, it's just a simple writing task, 2 sentences, maybe 3. Write 1 sentence with way and an adjective. Now, this is very important. When you ask students to come up with examples, especially verbally, they often struggle because for a lot of people, pulling an idea out of nothing, it is hard. It's hard to be creative and spontaneous. So I always give them a prompt. And as you can see here in number 1, I give them adjectives as prompts: long, short, easy. So for example, they may look at the word long and they think, okay, what can I associate with long? Or maybe a long movie. Oh yeah, I went to see this movie and it was way too long. 3 hours is too much. There we go. They have their sentence, relatable from their experience. Also, they can write 1 sentence with way too many and way too much. And of course, the idea here is to show how we use it grammatically, because that is important too. And maybe you can break this into 2 different sentences, one with way too many, so that they know how to use countable nouns, and then one with way too much, so they know how to use uncountable nouns. For example, people. Okay, everyone's been in a situation where they thought, there are way too many people here. There were way too many people. I got on the train this morning. There were way too many people. I went to the beach last Saturday because it was 30 degrees, but there were way too many people. Okay? And so that is, I should go back there. This is me introducing the vocabulary. Okay? And on subsequent days, I will quickly refresh. I will quickly ask, do you remember yesterday's word of the day? Way, very good. Can you use it in a sentence? Very good. And then later in the week, I'm going to do what I call a memory retrieval and consolidation activity. So they've already studied this word, and now this is one idea I did with them. It's a pair work, so I'm just going to keep it very simple. One student has to read the sentences you see on the right, and the other student has to react. They can respond with either sounds good or that's way la 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 la. So for example, student A says, let's eat 5 pizzas tonight. Student B hears that and thinks, that's way too many pizzas. Or number 2, let's go for a walk after lunch. Sounds good. Okay. So it's prompting the students to use them in context and to consolidate the vocabulary so that it stays in their memory and it's very contextual. Okay. Here's another one that I did. I'll go through this very quickly with B2 level. What do you know? A phrase of surprise. I thought I'd lost my keys, but what do you know? They were in my bag the whole time. And then I concept check again. What emotion is expressed in this phrase? Surprise. Am I looking for an answer to this question? No, it's an expression. It's rhetorical. And then I got them to do a personalized writing here. Now, with some phrases like, what do you know? It might be a bit difficult to ask them to write from nothing again. So I start with half a sentence. Finish the sentence. For example, number 2, I was walking through town. And what do you know? I bumped into my best friend from primary school. Okay? I'm sure, again, everyone has had that kind of moment when they bumped into someone they haven't seen in years. I would be shocked and appalled if this has never happened to you or to any of the students. Okay, so again, relatable. And then I brought this back later in the week. So I gave them a quiz to do. And the questions here are not so easy. They're not expected to know the answer. They'll probably have to guess the answer. Look at question 1. What country has the most pyramids? Is it Egypt, Sudan, Mexico, or Peru? Well, if you said Egypt, you are wrong. Sorry. If you said Mexico, wrong again. The answer is Sudan. Did you know that? If not, what can you say? What do you know? Exactly. So there, we're giving the student an opportunity to use it, not even as a role play. They're actually using it with a real emotion that they're feeling in that moment. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's pretty relatable, don't you? Okay. Another thing we can do is bringing back vocabulary passively. Now, this is important because obviously we would bring back vocabulary actively by doing reviews and whatnot. But it's also a good idea to bring it back passively. And what I mean by that is not drawing direct attention to the vocabulary, not asking, okay, this word, do you remember this word? What does it mean? No, don't do that at all. I will explain what you can do, but the reason for this is that reintroducing vocabulary through meaning-focused input, again, helps with retention. And normally we do this with, review exercises, quizzes, tests, and that's active, as I said, but passively. This should also be done passively. And you can do this with reading comprehensions and listening exercises. So authentic materials are obviously an option. Now, the only thing is, if you have a list of specific vocabulary that you want to review, it can be hard to find authentic material that covers it all. So one thing you can do, and now bear with me, I know not everyone is a fan. AI, if you like it, great. If you don't, fine. You don't have to do this, but I find that using AI can help you to create interesting content because realistically, you can create a reading comprehension about pretty much anything you want. Especially in my context, I live in Ireland and the textbooks that we use are British, so they don't really have any Irish content. So I might do make a reading comprehension that focuses on Ireland. And what I do is I ask ChatGPT or whatever to include the vocabulary that they have studied before. And so when they're reading it, they're going to see that vocabulary again passively. I'm not drawing attention to it again, but when they see it, ideally, it will refresh in their minds. They may forget it and they may ask you, oh, teacher, what does that mean again? That's fine, because if it's at the back of their mind and they're retrieving it, that is part of the consolidation process. And it's amazing. Now, I'll just speak very quickly. I find that ChatGPT, but especially Claude AI, are great for things like reading comprehensions and speaking exercises. Claude AI is especially good at creative writing. Google AI Studio, if you want to create listening comprehensions, and it's really good. Uh, the voices are really convincing. Yes, it is AI, but arguably, the how can I say, the voice acting talent of the AI is at least on par with the voice acting talent in some of the textbooks I've used. And you can use it to create not only single person dialogues like narratives, but even two-person things like podcasts and dialogues. Now I don't have time to show you how to do that, but it is at the end in the references. I can share this PowerPoint with you if you want to have a look at that. Um, Another thing, let me see. Okay, I'm already running out of time here. But another thing that you can do, so just very quickly, if you can see here on the left, these are nouns and verb collocations that we studied from the textbook. And on the right, we did a reading comprehension, and the key vocabulary is in bold. Then I brought this back passively with a speaking exercise. I should say, sorry, this was about festivals and carnivals. The speaking exercise that I did had nothing to do with festivals and carnivals, different topic, but it recycled the vocabulary and it's a fun activity. So, for example, if you look at number two, situation two, the midnight celebration, your neighbors are having a loud party at 2 a.m. They're setting off fireworks, blasting out music, and you can see them sitting around in a bonfire. And three vocabulary items are in that sentence alone. When I did this last week with my B2 class, none of them had to ask me what any vocabulary meant. Okay, one more thing is multimodal learning. And multimodal learning, this is basically doing things like role play and drama. This allows for 73% better recall, according to the research. I'll give you a case example. If you look at the bottom, I did physical actions with, for example, yawn, stretch, scratch, frown. So we studied that vocabulary, and then I got them to use gestures and movement. And I said, for example, okay, Larissa, can you stretch your arms and yawn loudly? Okay, uh, Maria, turn to Vitor and poke him gently in the shoulder. That visualizes the vocabulary. Then I had AI make a nice, funny story drama for me. I read this out to the students, but they're only listening, not reading. And you can see the same vocabulary is highlighted there. And I got them to physically act out this. So, for example, when I said yawning and stretching his short arms, the students would be like, ugh. Okay, so it really helps to visualize that vocabulary. Okay, finally, problematic vocabulary. I'm just going to say things like phrasal verbs and idioms. Don't lump these together. Look what happens when you lump all the phrasal verbs with get together. Imagine you're a non-native speaker of English. You see that list. You probably say, oh God, no, I can't memorize all that. So break them up. Focus just on one phrasal verb at a time. Make a mini lesson out of that and focus on one meaning because a lot of them have more than one. So, for example, get into, to develop an interest in something. Lately, I've really got into jazz music. Can you get into jazz music? And then I will have them do the task. If you see these elements on the right, I ask them, have you gotten into any of these? Would you get into any of these? Are there any of these that you could never get into, for example? Okay, unfortunately, I've run out of time. There are more. I will share this presentation slide with you so you can have a look at that again. Also, there are references at the end. Um, Unfortunately, I have to finish, so I'm going to hand you back to Lizzie now, but I am going to stay here for a few minutes and I'll answer any questions if you have them. Okay, so thank you very much for coming and thank you for listening. I hope it helps.